Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at the Listening Post. This week, all rise for the Leveson Inquiry into politics and the press in Great Britain. Tony Blair takes the stand and says Rupert Murdoch was not calling the tune. Julian Assange loses another stage in his extradition battle.
And his appeal against extradition is accordingly dismissed.
But he still hasn't gone anywhere. And 40 years after Watergate, what's left of the Washington Post and its reputation? The Leveson Inquiry into the state of the British press and the relationship between the world's biggest media baron and the politicians running that country continues to be compulsory viewing for anyone interested in the world of media. This past week, former Prime Minister Tony Blair testified. During his time in office, Blair met with Rupert Murdoch 38 times that we know of. And after leaving Downing Street, Blair quietly became a godfather to Murdoch's daughter. He told the inquiry there was nothing wrong with any of that and that Rupert Murdoch never lobbied him on a media-related issue. Jeremy Hunt, the Conservative cabinet minister, also had some explaining to do over why his office and the Murdoch empire seemed to swap friendly emails and text messages with the frequency of a pair of flirting teenagers. The list of witnesses has been long, but it seems to be growing less distinguished by the day. Andy Coulson, former tabloid editor turned communication strategist for Prime Minister David Cameron, was questioned by police this past week in a perjury case. His former boss, Rebecca Brooks, is already heading to court. A story that began years ago with that single rogue reporter is now tainting British government's past and present, and will likely lead to a new system of rules and regulations for newspapers in the United Kingdom. Our starting point this week is London and the Royal Courts of Justice, the site of the Leveson Inquiry.
The evidence that's come out of the Leveson Inquiry is simply astounding.
There was no deal on issues to do with the media.
Huge gaps have been exposed by this inquiry.
This story is only going to unfold for the years to come.
If nothing happens now, then we can really wave goodbye to an accountable and democratic media.
Back in 1995, Tony Blair flew all the way to Australia to court Rupert Murdoch. 17 years later, he would be grilled about that relationship under oath.
My relationship is completely different with him and with his family now.
The former Prime Minister is a skilled handler of questions from journalists or lawyers. He did admit the British media were already too powerful when he came to power. But he said he was not aligned with Rupert Murdoch, just that his government did not have the stomach or muscle to take on the media.
What we've learned from the Leveson Inquiry over the past few days is just how unwilling politicians were to tackle the power of the press in general, but Rupert Murdoch in particular. So Blair essentially said he didn't want to be diverted by tackling the press because he said that doing so would just throw his whole government off course. And I think that really gives an indication of just how powerful the press were, and in particular the Murdoch empire.
And he was kind of shockingly reasonable in his response, the way he said, well, this is just what happens, this is what we do, nobody should be surprised by this, there's nothing wrong with it. Whereas actually, if you dissect it and think of the amount of times he was courting the Murdoch empire, the level of intimate relationship that was going on, it was shocking.
There were 3 phone calls between Tony Blair and Rupert Murdoch in the 8 days prior to the Iraq invasion, a war that Murdoch wanted. When the media baron's child was baptized in 2010, there was an 18-page photo spread in Hello magazine. The media-wary Blair, the child's godfather, was careful to appear in none of them. Rupert Murdoch is now David Cameron's problem. The culture minister, Jeremy Hunt, was meant to keep his distance from the company over News Corp's B-Sky B takeover bid. However, the email and text traffic between Hunt's office and News Corp paints a different picture.
When you read those 1,000 emails, the first impression you get is just how many. It took me hours and hours and hours to read them. The sheer bulk, regardless of what's in them, tells you something very interesting about that relationship.
Fred Michel, the News Corps lobbyist, signing off his messages, you know, hope you're well, Papa, and things like that. And of course the government at this time was supposed to be an impartial judge of this takeover, had a legal duty to be impartial, and yet we now know they were secretly swapping information with each other.
It was the most dreadful error of Cameron to put Hunt in this so-called quasi-judicial role, given Hunt's on the record and behind the scenes position as a huge supporter of the Murdoch empire.
What those documents revealed was that actually Jeremy Hunt, he actually had voiced very strong opinions in favor of allowing that deal to go through to David Cameron. Now that is the closest we've gotten to date about drawing Mr. Cameron, the Prime Minister, into this issue. That poses some serious questions to him as to his judgment.
A striking similarity exists in how first News Corp and now the government have dealt with this scandal. The company initially fired a so-called rogue reporter, saying executives knew nothing about phone hacking. The government's first casualty was Jeremy Hunt's aide, Adam Smith. The minister insists he knew nothing about the nature of the email traffic between Smith and News Corp.
I was totally shocked when I discovered the level of that contact.
The way that the government has dealt with this scandal really does echo the way that News Corp dealt with it, in the sense that News Corp always said it was just one rogue reporter who happened to go to jail and that no one else was involved. And as we've gone through this process, we found that in fact it involved people much higher up the scale, and I think we'll see that in the government as well.
It's very hard to imagine that this wasn't happening on all sorts of levels throughout government, not just in the run-up to the B-Sky B bid. So it's, I think, indicative of a much bigger story on the relationship between big media corporation and political power.
The damage limitation phase that's going on in government is very similar to the one that went on at News International at the very beginning. We've been waiting for a long time to see how high up the political hierarchy this scandal would go.
And if the government's Adam Smith is the equivalent of News Corp's rogue reporter, and David Cameron and Rupert Murdoch head their respective organizations, then that would make Jeremy Hunt, who's still clinging to his job, the rough equivalent of Rebekah Brooks, the News Corp executive who lost hers, which added a little spice to the inquiry lawyer's reading of Adam Smith's text message to Hunt when Brooks resigned from News Corporation.
And then on the 15th of July, he tells you Rebekah Brooks has resigned, and you say, about bloody time. Which,
That was nothing personal against Mrs. Brooks.
So far, Prime Minister Cameron has said there is no reason for Hunt to resign, a decision the opposition Labour Party calls disgraceful.
He made the wrong choice.
Thank you very much, Steve.
With each passing day at the inquiry, it appears inevitable that the judge heading it will recommend an entirely new system of newspaper regulation. The days of badly behaved British papers regulating themselves are numbered.
Whether that revolution will actually be game changer and whether it will be minor tweaks around the edges to the existing system of press regulation in this country, I think is yet to be seen.
Lord Leveson has indicated quite strongly that he's in favour of statutory regulation. It won't be state-run, but neither will it be a sort of pussycat to the press. So I think we'll probably end up in the right situation with somewhere between full state control of the media and a self-regulatory mechanism which doesn't work.
For politicians like Jeremy Hunt and many, many others before him, they'll soon have to find someone other than a media baron to call the tune. If they're stuck for ideas, they could try voters. Our Global Village voice is now on the impact the Leveson Inquiry's had on politics in the UK.
The Leveson Inquiry is a necessary but largely symbolic telling off of the media. It could well lead to a clampdown on future overt law-breaking by media outlets, such as phone hacking, but other major problems that are deeply entrenched in the British media are likely to continue.
The media has failed to police itself for decades, and passing laws to curtail their activities will be portrayed as a police state. However, tightening up the law on covert operations on members of the public, where it's of no legitimate public interest, is a strong possibility. Will MPs change? I doubt it. Once the dust has settled, they will probably revert to their own ways. Will Murdoch survive the storm? Of course he will.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. The highest court in the United Kingdom has ruled that WikiLeaks co-founder Julian Assange can be extradited to Sweden over alleged sex crimes. This case has been at legal issue since 2010, when Swedish prosecutors issued an arrest warrant over allegations made by 2 WikiLeaks volunteers.
His appeal against extradition is accordingly dismissed.
Assange has 14 days to convince the European Court of Human Rights to hear an appeal. But his lawyers are saying that they may try another appeal in the UK over a legal point in this latest ruling, which went against Assange by a vote of 5-2. Assange's lawyers have also said in the past that their client was the victim of a honey trap set to silence Assange and the work of his whistleblowing website. One of the oft-repeated caveats used by news organizations covering the Arab Spring, especially the story in Syria, has been, we are unable to independently verify this image or footage. Here's one of the dangers with that. In reporting an alleged massacre in the city of Hula, the British Broadcasting Corporation used this photo of bodies of victims in Hula awaiting burial. However, it later emerged that the photo was not taken by a Syrian activist, but by an Italian photographer, Marco Di Loro, 9 years earlier in Iraq. The photographer was later quoted as saying that he was astonished that the BBC did not check its sources and published his image. The BBC said that it stopped using the photo as soon as it realized its error. However, the Syrian government will still be able to use the misreporting as an example of what it calls the clear bias of the Western news media. In Myanmar, there's been a small legal victory in a court case involving a magazine. However, it could prove to be significant in the months and years ahead. Back in April, a government official made a promise on our program saying that censorship in Myanmar would be abolished by the end of the year.
And there will be no censorship.
Journalists say there is still censorship, but it's been eased, and the new threat comes from lawsuits. In March, the Ministry of Mining brought a libel case against one of Myanmar's boldest publications, The Voice. The case stems from an article alleging that funds were misappropriated within 6 government ministries between 2009 and 2011. The government demanded that the paper's editor-in-chief, Kya Min Sui, disclose the name of the journalist who wrote that article. The magazine refused to do that, and this past week the court ruled in the magazine's favor. However, the publication could still be found guilty of defamation, with the case resuming next month. We'll keep an eye on the country to see whether the new media law does what the government said it will, bring censorship to an end in Myanmar. There's some big economic news coming out of Greece these days. It's hardly the time then for the country to go through a media blackout. But that's what happened when journalists took to the streets of Athens for a 24-hour strike to protest job losses and wage cuts in the media sector. With participation in the strikes effectively compulsory due to the rules of labor unions there, most television and radio stations had a day without any news programs. For the print media, the impact was slightly delayed. Most titles were unable to put out a paper the following day. Greece's media sector has been devastated by the country's financial crisis and recession, with more than 4,000 job losses since 2010, wages slashed by up to 30%, and many employees have gone months without seeing a paycheck. When we did this story last month, we showed you television workers occupying their channel's building, living there and cooking their meals on a kitchen set in a studio. It's a rare case of economic reality TV. 40 years ago this month, a bungled burglary at a Democratic Party office in Washington, D.C. set in motion one of the most famous political scandals in history. Watergate led to the downfall of Richard Nixon, the first and only American president to resign from the White House. It also launched the newspaper, The Washington Post, into the Media Hall of Fame. The Post's work on the Watergate story set a new standard for investigative reporting and sent thousands of young Americans stampeding into U.S. journalism schools. The Washington Post and Watergate made journalism trendy. Times have changed. The Post recently reported a 10% drop in its circulation. 2 decades ago, the paper sold 830,000 copies a day. Now that number is slightly more than 500,000. The Washington Post is not the only newspaper struggling in the era of the World Wide Web. However, few publications have fallen from such a great height. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on a legendary paper going through some hard times. The nostalgia in Washington for the Post's glory days and the challenges for investigative journalism in the digital age.
On June 18, 1972, the Washington Post ran a front-page story, a story that would shake up American politics.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
That would eventually bring down Richard Nixon.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
And catapult the Washington Post into the national even global spotlight.
The notion of the Washington Post as that entity and as that force in American journalism, it entirely changed the way people thought about what journalists could actually achieve.
It put the Washington Post on the map. It made it nationally prominent when it hadn't been prominent previously. So it really was a watershed moment.
Almost no other paper enjoyed the glory the Washington Post did during its heyday. Editor Ben Bradlee and reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward all became legends of their times. The Post was featured in the film All the President's Men, which showed the reporters doing many things it's criticized for not doing today. For instance, having an editor willing to commit 2 journalists for 2 years to a single story and refusing to bow to political pressure.
Get some harder information next time.
I don't see the kind of reporting projects that come out that really sock you between the eyes and that you're rushing to get your newspaper, and you don't have these really blood feuds going on with the administrations in power, and so it leads people to conclude that everybody in Washington is in bed with everybody else.
Today's Washington Post is a much more fearful place than the Washington Post of 40 years ago. Today's Washington Post doesn't have a Ben Bradlee who didn't care what the White House wanted. What we've seen over the last decade especially is a Washington Post that tends to be less courageous in calling it like it sees it.
There is also a change in this value of that kind of reporting. It's seen as old school, very old-fashioned. Lots of people who are coming to the media today and doing incisive commentary and analysis, but it seems more impossible for people to sort of dig in to these long-term projects.
The Post of recent times bears little resemblance to what it was then. Dan Frumkin spent 6 years at the paper and was critical of the Bush administration. Early in the Obama era, management said his blog wasn't, quote-unquote, working anymore.
During that period, it seemed obvious to me that there was a lot of stuff coming out of the White House that was misinformation and lies. And I was a contractor. I worked at home. I was sort of immune from the political pressure of the Washington Post newsroom. There was something about the corporate structure of the newspaper, of the modern Washington Post, that didn't let them write the stories that they should have.
The Post's had some journalistic triumphs. Barton Gellman's reporting on Dick Cheney's time in office, Dana Priest's exposing the US intelligence apparatus, and James Grimaldi won a Pulitzer in 2006. His reporting on the Abramoff lobbying scandal had some powerful people in Washington running for cover. Grimaldi, though, is part of a shrinking investigative team. He recently took a buyout and is heading for the Wall Street Journal, but still says the Post is a quality newspaper.
The rumors of investigative reporting's death is greatly exaggerated, as Mark Twain once said. In fact, the Post in particular still has a very active investigative unit and has investigative reporters throughout the newsroom. And it's an important part of its mission.
There are pockets of great reporting that the paper still puts out in that old school style. The problem that the Post has had is that they have been cutting away at their newsroom, and it has just created a newspaper that's focused much more on the shrinking size of its own workforce than it is on doing some of those really in-depth and investigative projects.
Every newspaper in the country is facing that kind of challenge because the resources are not what they were, the advertising revenue is not what it was, and investigative reporters have always had a hard time justifying their existence because sometimes they work for weeks or months on something and it doesn't pay off.
Investigative journalism is changing. The print industry may be getting smaller, but it's collaborating with new independent organizations like ProPublica, which are funding in-depth reports to fill in the gap and winning Pulitzers in the process.
Investigative reporting may be more important today than it ever has been. It drives original content on the internet, and we're all becoming much more internet-driven news organizations. And if you're looking for original content, there's nothing more original than investigative reporting.
Like every newspaper, the Post has tried to reinvent itself for the digital age, but it's missed opportunities along the way. 20 years ago, the paper's then managing editor, Bob Kaiser, devised a survival strategy that proved to be way before its time. He predicted that the internet would overtake print and urged the Post to lead the way.
Bob Kaiser's memo, written in '92, was extraordinary, visionary. I think you went back and looked at it today, you would say, wow, that guy got it. And this is 20 years ago, right? The Post could have absolutely seized the mantle of, U.S. accountability journalism online, could have been a tremendous player.
4 decades ago this month, the Washington Post began on an investigative journey that would make journalistic history. The question today is where it goes from here.
The Post will be smaller in the future, but may be nimbler and better able to compete. It just will not ever be the size it was, say, about 10 or 12 years ago.
It will always be there, I think. More probably in digital form, but I think we have still enough people in Washington who are committed to holding a newspaper in their hands.
The future of the Post will inevitably be less storied than its past. It's almost guaranteed. I mean, I don't think the people at the Washington Post woke up one day and they said, oh, we'd like to just have fewer journalists doing less impressive stories. Let's do it that way. I think that it was something that, because of the business pressures, that became an outcome that they are now grappling with and trying to save this great legacy.
More Global Village Voices now on the post-Watergate Washington Post.
What happened in 1972 could absolutely happen again today. The fact is, Washington, D.C. is still flooded with reporters covering every aspect of government and politics. On top of it, all the digital startups have created even more watchdogs.
Corporations no longer place the value on investigative journalism that they did 40 years ago. I recently had the opportunity to see David Simon, creator of The Wire and former journalist, speak. And he said that the corporations realized that they could produce a more mediocre product and cut their bottom line by sacrificing good investigative journalism and good journalism in general. And that is why you will probably not see any journalists today taking down a president.
We don't check the Post to see what's going on in Washington. We occasionally check in with the Post to see what they have to say about the stories that we're following on Twitter and Google+. The Post's credibility was probably damaged by its complicity in the WMD deception, but for me the paper is like the Peter Lorre character in Casablanca. He says to Rick, "Rick, you despise me, don't you?" Rick says, "If I gave you any thought, I probably would."
Finally, for media junkies such as ourselves, the Leveson Inquiry into the state of British journalism and politics has all the ingredients of a televised drama: seasoned performers, dangerous liaisons, and unexpected twists. The people at the Poke website, who say they want you to spend time well wasted, captured some of that when they created an auto-tuned hip-hop version of the Leveson story. A fast-paced A-list production starring the likes of Rupert and James Murdoch, actors Sienna Miller and Hugh Grant. This week's web video of the week is called Leveson, the Musical. We'll see you next time at the Listening Post.
Did you have any discussions with Jeremy Hunt about the bid?
I don't think so. I have no memory of it.
For a number of years, I was relentlessly pursued by about 10 to 15 men. I was relentlessly pursued. I just don't think that there's that very old-fashioned view, if you will. Very old-fashioned view, if you will. Very old-fashioned view, if you will. Of media providers and, being able to dominate the landscape. Being able to dominate the landscape. Dominate the landscape. Occasionally you would sign them off. LOL. Until I told him it meant laugh out loud, laugh out loud, laugh out loud, laugh
out loud. I'm not going anywhere there. Please sit down or leave.
na 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 na.